On the 26th of April, 1865, a photographer at Helena, Arkansas, aimed his camera at a steamboat so crowded it seemed the river itself might tip. Her decks were black with men, thin, ragged, sunburned men in worn Union blue, packed rail to rail, clinging to the stairways and the hurricane deck above. They were soldiers going home. Most had just walked out of the Confederate prison camps at Andersonville and Cahaba. The war was all but over. The hardest part, they believed, was behind them. A little more than a day later, a few miles above Memphis, in the blackest part of the night, the river blew apart beneath them. The disaster the war buried, the Sultana. To understand the Sultana, you have to begin not with the boat, but with the men and where they had been. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate prison system was collapsing along with the Confederacy itself. At Andersonville in Georgia, tens of thousands of Union prisoners had been penned in an open stockade with no shelter. Of the men sent there, roughly 1 in 3 never left. At Cahaba in Alabama, they had shivered in a flooded warehouse on the banks of the river. As the South came apart, its exchange officers began paroling these men by the thousand, emptying the pens faster than anyone could count them. They were gathered at a place called Camp Fisk, a parole camp at 4 Mile Bridge outside Vicksburg. There they waited, hollow-eyed, many barely able to walk, for boats to carry them up the Mississippi and home. Ohio and Michigan, Indiana and Tennessee, Kentucky and West Virginia, whole regiments worth of survivors, more than 500 from Ohio alone. Among them was a school teacher turned soldier, Sergeant John Clark Ellie of the 115th Ohio. Ellie had kept a diary all through his captivity, and he kept it still as the waiting ended and the boats began to load. His last entry was written the day the Sultana took them aboard.
Very fine day. Still upward we go. Sergeant John Clark Ely, the 26th of April, 1865.
He never wrote another word. John Clark Ely died in the explosion, and his diary, recovered afterward, became one of the few voices from inside the disaster not shaped, decades later, by the act of remembering. What it records is not dread, it is ordinary hope. Every account agrees on the mood aboard. These were men who had counted on dying in prison and had lived instead, who had heard, on the river, that Lee had surrendered and the war was ending. They were, by their own testimony, happy.
A happier crowd I never saw. We all felt that a few more hours would land us at home, where anxious friends were awaiting our return. Private A.C. Brown, 2nd Ohio Infantry. Remembering that April, 1865.
The boat carrying them was less than 3 years old, a fine, fast, side-wheel steamer built for the trade between St. Louis and New Orleans. Her name was Sultana. By law and by her own paperwork, she was licensed to carry 376 people. Her master and part owner, Captain James Cass Mason, had every reason to want her full. The government paid to move paroled prisoners north by the head, a set fee for each enlisted man, more for each officer. A boat that carried 1,000 soldiers earned a great deal more than a boat that carried a few hundred. And at Vicksburg, that April, a great many soldiers were waiting to move. What happened at the Vicksburg landing was not an accident of crowding. It was a decision. The officers responsible, among them the department's chief quartermaster, Colonel Reuben Hatch, and Captain George Williams, who oversaw the parolees, funneled almost the entire camp onto a single boat. Other steamers lay at the same levee, willing to take a share of the men. They were not used. When the gangplanks came up at last, the Sultana carried, by the Army's own later count, at least 2,021 people, soldiers, crew, guards, and a handful of civilian passengers. Later reconstructions put the number higher still, more than 5 times her legal limit. The officer who investigated it afterward did not mince words.
I am of the opinion that the shipment of so large a number of troops, 1,866 on one boat, was, under the circumstances, unnecessary, unjustifiable, and a great outrage on the troops. General William Hoffman, Commissary General of Prisoners, the 19th of May, 1865.
For years afterward, a comfortable story circulated that the men themselves had insisted on going home together on the same boat, that the crowding had been their own doing. Hoffman's investigation found no truth in it. The men, he wrote, would gladly have divided between two boats lying side by side. They were crowded together not by their own wish, but by the choices of the officers above them.
The men were exceedingly anxious to return to their homes, but they felt they were treated with unkindness and harshness when they were crowded together on one boat, when another equally good was lying alongside. There is no foundation for the belief that they wished it so. William Hoffman, May, 1865.
There was one more decision, the one that would actually kill them. Somewhere below Vicksburg, on her way up from New Orleans, one of the Sultana's 4 boilers had begun to leak. At Vicksburg, a local boilermaker named R.G. Taylor was called to look at it, and what he found alarmed him. The iron had bulged. 2 of the seams, he judged, needed to be cut out and replaced. That was a repair of several days the boat's schedule and the waiting prisoners would not allow.
The repair was not perfect. The 2 sheets adjoining the leak should have been taken out. R.G. Taylor, boilermaker at Vicksburg, 1865.
Instead, over Taylor's objection, a patch was hammered on, a piece of iron thinner than the plate it covered, riveted over the bulge to hold the pressure just long enough. Then the boilers were fired, the prisoners were loaded on top of them, and the Sultana was cleared to go north. No one inspected the vessel before the men came aboard. A patched boiler, an overloaded hull, a swollen spring river running hard against her. Every element was now in place. All it needed was the dark. The Sultana pulled away from Memphis a little after midnight on the 27th of April, swung out against the current, and steamed into a wide, flooded reach of the river some 7 miles above the city. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. Most of the men were asleep. And the boilers, strained by the current, by the overload, and by that thin new patch, let go. 3 of the 4 exploded at once in a single blast that threw scalding steam and iron and burning men into the night and tore the heart out of the ship.
I stood bewildered for a moment, and then saw the river perfectly alive with human beings, struggling in the water. Nathan Wintringer, chief engineer of the Sultana, in a later recollection.
What followed is almost beyond describing, and the survivors, writing years afterward, struggled to. The center of the boat became a furnace. The tall chimneys came crashing down. The decks folded into the fire. Men who could not swim leapt anyway, into water still cold and high with the spring flood. Some drowned in the grip of others. Some clung to wreckage, to drowning horses, to each other, and were carried miles downstream in the dark. Many of them had survived Andersonville. They died now within sight of the lights of Memphis. One of them, a young Michigan private named Chester Berry, remembered a prayer as he went into the river.
I clutched the board and hissed between my set teeth, "Mother, by the help of God, your prayer shall be answered." Private Chester Berry, 20th Michigan Infantry, remembering the river.
The first help came out of the same darkness that hid them. A downbound steamer, the Bostona, reached the wreck near 2:30 and began pulling men from the water. Boats from the ironclad Essex and the gunboat Tyler joined the search. At Fort Pickering, on the Memphis Bluff, the garrison, including United States colored troops, built fires along the shore, launched skiffs, and carried the scalded and the half-drowned up to the city's hospitals. The rescuers worked by sound as much as by sight.
The morning was very dark, it being about 1 hour before daylight. and the shrieks of the wounded and the drowning men were the only guide we had. Acting Ensign James Berry, United States Ship Essex, the 27th of April, 1865.
How many died that night is a question the record cannot fully answer, and the reason is itself part of the story. There was never a complete passenger list. The Army's official report set the dead at 1,238. A later customs figure raised it to 1,547. The most careful modern reconstruction, built from pension files and regimental rolls, lands lower, somewhere near 1,200. Whichever number is nearest the truth, it means the same thing. On that one night, more than half of everyone aboard was killed. It made the Sultana the deadliest maritime disaster in American history, a grim distinction she has never lost. In sheer loss of life, she rivaled, and by some counts surpassed, the Titanic, which would go down almost half a century later with the eyes of the whole world upon her. The Sultana went down with almost no one watching, and the difference between those two nights, one remembered forever, one very nearly forgotten, had little to do with the number of the dead. There was, at first, an appetite for blame. There had been money in the overload, and there had been warning against it. An officer named Kearns had objected to piling the whole camp onto one boat and been overruled. Suspicion settled first and hardest on Colonel Reuben Hatch, the quartermaster nearest the center of the loading. Hatch carried a documented history of corruption charges. When the Army convened its inquiry, he was the man it most needed to hear from. He simply refused to appear.
Though 3 times subpoenaed to give his testimony, and though the trial was prolonged 3 months that his presence might be secured, he refused to obey the summons. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt on Colonel Hatch, 1866.
In the end, only one officer was ever brought to trial, Captain Frederick Speed, who had helped process the parolees. He was convicted, and then the conviction was set aside, the reviewing judge himself concluding that the blame had fallen on very nearly the wrong man. Hatch was never punished. Mason, the captain, was dead in the river. No one, in the end, was held to account for the greatest loss of life at sea in the nation's history. A marker near the wreck would one day put it plainly: no one was ever punished. So why did America forget? Not because the disaster went unreported, it did not. Memphis papers carried it that same morning. The New York Times ran it the next day. The problem was the calendar. The Sultana blew apart in the most crowded news week of the century. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated 13 days before, and his funeral train was still crossing the north, drawing millions into the streets. John Wilkes Booth had been cornered and shot the very day the Sultana loaded her prisoners. General Johnston's army was laying down its arms. A nation with only so much grief to give had already spent it. And the disaster left memory little to hold. Its dead were not famous men. They were enlisted soldiers, many of them lost from the record, without even a complete roster to name them. There was no satisfying trial, no villain brought low, and there was no wreck to visit. In the years that followed, the Mississippi shifted its channel, and the burned bones of the Sultana came to rest, not on any riverbed a diver could reach, but under an Arkansas farm field a couple of miles from where the water now runs. A disaster you cannot see is a disaster that is easy to forget. But it was not forgotten by everyone. The dead were buried first at Fort Pickering and later gathered into the Memphis National Cemetery, where many of them lie among the ranks of the unknown. The men who lived would not let it go. In the North, and then in the South, the survivors formed associations, met each year, read the roll, and kept the names alive. One of them, that same Chester Berry, who had gone into the river with his mother's prayer, spent years collecting their accounts into a single book so that the story could not quietly disappear. Barry knew what erasure felt like. Listed at first among the dead, he later had to prove to his own government that he had ever been aboard the Sultana at all. Others grieved sooner and more simply.
I must confess that, to the best of my knowledge, William is among the lost. I have no hope of ever hearing from him anymore. Private Samuel Pickens, writing to his mother, the 28th of April, 1865.
The great public monuments never came. A campaign to raise one in Ohio collapsed for want of support. The survivors themselves thinned year by year until a reunion in 1930 drew a single old man who read the roll to an empty room and went home. Only in our own time has the memory found solid ground. In markers, in a Remembrance Day, and at last in a museum near the wreck at Marion, Arkansas, built to hold the names the country mislaid. It is worth returning at the end to the man who never lived to remember any of it. Sergeant John Clark Ely, going home up the river, closed his diary for the last time with 3 plain words of hope.
Still upward we go. John Clark Ely. His last written words, the 26th of April, 1865.
They had survived the war. They had survived the prisons. They believed, almost home. The Sultana took more Americans than any disaster at sea before or since. And the nation, its grief already spent, looked away. Remember them.